Now we're going to talk about ascent of sap. In the significance of transpiration, we had discussed that the role of transpiration is so important because it brings about the ascent of sap from the root hair till the leaves, and it is the transpiration pull which is responsible for bringing up that column of water. So when we study ascent of sap, there were again in this case a lot of theories were proposed, and in those theories we had how water moves up. So the first one that we had already discussed was the pulsation theory. It was proposed by an Indian scientist. We don't take into account any of these because we will study the one which is most relevant from today's point of view. Then later on, pulsation theory somehow gave rise to the root pressure theory, which we had discussed that it led to failure of this theory because the root pressure was almost negligible for tall plants. Then we had capillarity theory. And as we were advancing in these theories, some or other important points, the good points, were taken up for the next theory as well. And lastly came the cohesion, tension, transpiration, pull theory, which is in use today. Cohesion, tension, transpiration, pull theory, very long name. And the names itself having the explanatory purpose being served. This was proposed by Dickson and Joly, two scientists, and in 1894 they gave this theory. Later on, around 1914, this particular scientist, he further amended it and gave the proper Dickson transpiration pull theory. So we are going to take into account this. We had discussed about root pressure theory. Pulsation theory is quite obsolete one, so we are not going to discuss about that. If you can recall, in root pressure theory, we had discussed that there is a pressure, positive pressure, that is being exerted by the water column itself, okay, inside the root cells. Then came the concept of capillarity. You know, when we talk about the anatomy of the plant, the small cells that form the plant tissue, they act as tiny tubes which can act as capillary. So one point that was taken from this theory is that water column is going to rise automatically upwards because of the very small diameter of the tubes, and that is as seen in the case of capillary tubes. You must have understood in your classes of chemistry that there is a tendency of water column to rise upwards automatically because of the very narrow lumen of the tracheids. In the case of xylem, I am taking over here. Lastly, this complete theory, which is quite acceptable except for few objections that were raised later on and they were not satisfactorily answered, as much as 95% of the objections which were raised in these three theories were covered by the last theory, that is cohesion, tension, transpiration, pull theory. So one by one we are going to take each name inside it into consideration and see what they talk about. First thing is that they are talking about cohesion. Now you know the water molecules, they are bound to each other, they stick to each other. We have water in the form of a liquid because of the cohesive forces which are present inside the water molecules. The hydrogen bonds that are being formed, that is why water molecules do not tend to move away from each other. So we have cohesion, which makes sure that there is a continuous column, not exactly continuous column, but water molecules are bound to each other. Second is, because we are talking about tertiary elements, there is another tendency of water molecules to join to the walls in whichever container they are. So if we are having tertiary elements like this, the water molecule will be sticking to the walls of this tube and in turn as well sticking to each other, because of which the water column would be maintained and it is going to rise automatically upwards as a result of capillarity. This is what happens. And the third thing is that there is a tension inside this water column that is being maintained, and this tension is as a result of transpiration pull. Now, how this transpiration pull takes place? You remember the anatomy of a leaf that we did. Upper epidermis, lower epidermis, the mesophyll cells, they are always saturated with water because we had studied that they take up so much of water that is being taken. They are saturated with water. But what about the atmosphere that these mesophyll cells are in contact with due to presence of stomata? You remember the structure we did? This was the lower epidermis, these were the stomatas, and over here we had mesophyll cells like this, spongy mesophyll. Now these cells, they are what? They are saturated with water, but here over we are having the atmosphere which can never ever get saturated with water. Now this connection between the mesophyll cells and the atmosphere through opened stomata results in a condition where the water content inside the mesophyll cells get evaporated and is given out, and this is what transpiration is, right? The release of water in the form of water vapors from the exposed surface, the water is being lost. Now this particular cell has come under water stress, so what it will do, it will take up the water from the adjacent cells. Now this adjacent cell, when it gives the water to these cells, this also is going to come under water stress, and these cells, the palisade or the rest of the mesophyll cells which are not in directly contact with the stomata, which were saturated with water, are also becoming water deficient. Now when they become water deficient, they are going to take up the water from the trachary elements because they are in contact with trachary elements directly of the xylem, of course. Now that trachary element is going to take up the water, give it to the cell which is deficient in water, and it is in contact with the root. Because of this continuous release of water vapors, which is entirely a physical process, into the atmosphere, there is a generation of tension in the water column from the trachary elements till the mesophyll, okay? Mesophyll air spaces rather, I would say. So we see a tension, and this tension is responsible because of the negative pull which is being generated. So this is all that we have as the principle behind this theory. So I'm going to repeat it. You can just imagine it in terms of anatomy of the plant, that because the water is being involved, water is absorbed from the root, a little bit of root pressure is there, the water gets absorbed by the root cells due to the osmolarity differences between the cells, it gets absorbed. Once it has been absorbed, there is a continuous tension column that is formed between the trachary elements. Now we had talked that tension started from here it went to the mesophyll cell, this mesophyll took up and passed it to the trachary elements. Now the trachary elements, from where they are going to take the water? They are going to take the water from the root cells, and root cells are going to take the water from the soil itself. So this is the Ascent of Sap theory, which very well describes how the water is taken up from the soil and given to the uppermost region of the leaf, okay, because of a tension and a negative pull that is being created by the process of transpiration that is continuously going on. Due to the radiant energy, the tension pull enables the water to be carried out. Now because the water being carried inside and taken upwards is under the osmotic pressure changes, or you can say osmotic concentration changes. Osmosis is the main driving force, and of course the negative force which develops the tension. Along with the water, minerals are also transported in the sideline cases, and this results to the sap moving upwards. So this is all about ascent of sap that you need to understand, that the transpiration pull theory gives the complete hold to the force of transpiration, which develops a tension inside the water column. That water column itself is being formed by these two properties of the water molecules. Water has cohesion property where the water molecules are joined to each other. Apart from that, they have adhesion ability, which adhesion means getting stick to something, okay. So they get bind to the wall of trachary elements. Now there are millions of trachary elements which are present one by one, so entire column is being formed with thin tubes, you can say. Supposedly you are having one tube, this thin, one tube, like this. There are many tubes which are taking up the water due to capillarity. This entire is a column, okay, and this column is under a tension that is being exerted by the leaves. So this is what we have in the Ascent of Sap theory, the most recent one, that is cohesion, tension, transpiration, pull theory. In case you're not able to understand, you need to watch the videos where we have discussed about transpiration as a process, its definition we had discussed. And do keep in mind, when you study transpiration with respect to anatomical features of the plant, it would be easier for you to understand this particular theory, because cohesion and tension, they're totally physical processes. Because of the chemical properties of water molecules, this cohesion leads to generation of a tension in the entire water column that begins from the root hair to the stomatal pores, which are in contact with the atmosphere, while the root hair is in contact with the capillary water of the soil. So this is all about Ascent of Sap.